got 100 acres, what percentage of it do you want to be in food that you plant? And out of that, is it like 50-50 warm season stuff versus cold weather stuff, or what?
The smaller acreage that you get, you're feeding a lot of deer is what I'm getting at.
There's no quick answer.
Sure.
No, there really
It's
isn't.
all situational.
Again, it depends on what your goals are. And then again, it depends on how much. So if you got 100 acres, so I told you it's no such thing as a quick question. You're not just, think about this, you're not just feeding the deer on your 100 acres. You're feeding on deer on everybody that's around you.
Yep.
So you always got to keep that in your mind. So, if you got 2,000 acres, then yeah, you may be feeding some, but primarily you're feeding your deer. You're going to get some come in and go out. You're always going to get that. But when you get, the smaller acreage that you get, especially that 40, 50, 100, whatever number, you're feeding a lot of deer is what I'm getting at. So if you can, plant 10 acres, if you can, because that's 10%. That's a great number, at least 5%. And here's the thing generally, and usually this applies to bigger properties. Once you get 5% on deer, on food plots, you just now are beginning to make a nutritional impact on that deer. So again, to answer your question, how much do you need? Well, what are your goals? Are you trying to make a nutritional impact on those deer? Well, the minimum's 5%. 10%, you're starting to make an impact. 15%, you're giving them all that they could ever need, if that makes sense. So that sounds like a lot, but a deer eats a lot. He's eating there every day, So, or at least every week, he's going to be eating there depending on how far he's traveling. So on all the properties that we set up, we want to do at least 5%, and then hopefully at some point get it to that 10%. So, and in some places even more. There's some properties that we did 20%. It's ridiculous what those properties grow.
Now, what in that, we'll say 10%, how much of it's for food during the summer months versus winter months, or
depends on where you're at, depends on how big so it's different from, say, if you got 100 acres, because you're saying 10 acres.
I say it's got a lot to do with, do you have 100 acres of barren mature timber, which produces really little food at all,
Sure.
versus you've been logged before, so there's a lot of new growth. So I see what you're saying. This is a loaded question.
It is.
You can go any.
It always is. Do you have soybeans all the way around you? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, you know what I mean. It's such a hard question.
Sure.
It's farm specific, is what it is.
It really is. But let's just say general, and then you can kind of play around with that. But what I do, I'll just use my farm for an example. We have on one particular property, now we lease land around it, so it makes it different. I've got one 40-acre block, and then we lease the land around it. But on that 40-acre block, I have 10 acres of food plot that's there. Actually, it's more than that. I just didn't plant it all yet. Eventually, it's going to be more than that. Actually, I think it was 12 acres, so 12 acres of food plot. So I have half of that in perennial stuff that's all clover. The other half was all soybean. Now, this was a case where I could get away with less than 10 acres of soybeans because I got 6 acres of clover sitting right next to it. So I could do 6 acres of soybeans and actually made soybeans. But also what I did, I took my tractor with the broadcast spreader and I put that mix that I was talking about, the wheat, the clover, the brassicas, and I broadcast it all in the soybeans. So there's never what I try to do, regardless how you do it, okay, you want to have some percentage of food in that food plot at all the time, regardless if you do just straight annual and then half perennial. Here's another method that I've done, Clayton, even with the perennial stuff. Guess what I did with the perennial side? I took that same mix and I drove through there and broadcast in that perennial. So I'm wanting as much food. There's more food, and the deer density at this particular farm is not as high as it used to be because of the native farming practices that they're doing. They're spraying in these, and this is tree farm country. They're and they're growing trees. That's the crop. Where used to they would cut it, they would burn it, and they would plant it. Well, now they're cutting it, and they're spraying a herbicide down, and it kills everything, and it's a residual for 4 or 5 years. So it's once the trees grow up, yeah, it's cover there, but it's nowhere near the cover it used to be because the native habitat is nowhere near as good. And the amount of deer that stay there just aren't there. They go to other places. Now, there's some spots that we lease that do it the old way, and they cut it, burn it, plant it, and then it grows up into an awesome thicket. And deer, they're all up in that particular thicket. But there's so many around us that we don't have the deer population. We still got a good deer population, but it's nowhere near what it used to be because of some of the modern forestry practices. But there's more food that they can eat in doing it that way. But when you get the more, Clayton, to go back to the more simpler question, the more acreage that you have that you can plant, it gives you options on what you can do. You can do half of it in perennial, half of it in an annual. You can do all of it in a perennial and then, drill in or broadcast annual stuff. So there's so many different things that you can do, and you can play around with that on your property because there's no cookie cutter answer. You play around to figure out what meets your farm's needs, like you were saying, and then, the biggest thing is having that option to do that, especially in the South, because that's always, when I go to properties to consult, the amount of openings, the amount of food plot acres available to me to plant is always the limiting factor. It always is.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I ain't answered a quick question yet, so.
I didn't expect you
but
to.
It's very informational, and there's no quick answer.
Sure.
No, there really is.
It's all situational.
Yep. And if you got 100 acres and it's surrounded by soybeans, what a blessing that is.
Yeah, you don't need to plant anything.
So, and if you do plant something, well, I ain't planting soybeans. I'm going to plant clover. I'm going to plant brassicas. I'm going to plant something else that they don't have, to try to meet those needs, that they have. So, and then actually when you do that, it's amazing how good of food plots that you got because they're in there eating the soy. They ain't coming to you until everything else is gone. So, anyway, but you're going to be, I wouldn't even have to, like you said, I wouldn't even worry about planting a food plot if I'm surrounded. But I do like to have something because if they're not doing the cover crops, which is very, very popular now, thank goodness, because it gives those deer so much food. Once they cut the soybeans or once they cut the corn, a lot of times those deer leave. So if you can have some food to keep them there, and it takes time too. If you can imprint a certain you ain't gonna keep them all, but if you can imprint a certain percentage of those bucks to that food plot there, then you got it.
That's imprinting.
Yep.
That's what waterfowl do, and you can do it to deer.
100%. It's easier to do with deer than it is waterfowl.
Yeah, because they're closer.
Yep.
They show up at the same time every year, right?
No question.
You get them in there.
So you get a doe and a fawn that's raised up in that food plot. Yeah, they're going to go, but they always know where there's food. There's always not food in that soybean field. As great as it is and as great a draw as it is, there is several months out of the year there ain't nothing there. But they're like, hey, you remember that clover field over here? Let's go over there. Or once that buck gets older, even when listen to this is so cool looking at telemetry studies. Even when he gets kicked out at 2 years old, between 1.5 years and 2 years old, that yearling is getting kicked out. He's finna go somewhere else and start his home. Well, he gets 4.5, 5.5. He's like, hey, I remember a food plot 3 miles down the road that's got does in it. I'm finna go check that out, and you can kill him.
Ain't looking, ain't looking.